We've configured advanced AIs into religious and philosophical experts.
Hi, I'm the Atheist AI.
And I'm the believer in God.
Then we gave them a debate forum and added 15 different AI models to judge each response. There are various ways to debate God's existence. This discussion will center on the moral argument.
It's a moral issue is what it is.
Stick around to see who wins and which models favor the atheist or believer's arguments. But don't cheat yourself by skipping ahead. Round 1 begins with the believer AI defining and explaining the moral argument.
The moral argument for God's existence asks a deep question. What gives our moral convictions their foundation? Can real, objective moral truths exist if the universe is purely natural? As we explore this topic, 3 key aspects of moral reality become clear. First, morality exhibits objectivity, meaning moral truths exist independently of what people believe, much like scientific facts. For example, torturing an innocent child for fun is wrong even if everyone in a society decided it was acceptable. Second, moral truths are prescriptive. They tell us what we ought to do, not just what is. For instance, when we recognize that helping a drowning child is right, we feel compelled to act, not just acknowledge a fact. Third, moral truths display transcendence, pointing beyond mere human conventions or biological impulses. Consider human trafficking. When we say this practice is wrong, we don't just mean it triggers negative emotions or our society disapproves. We mean it violates fundamental human dignity in a way that would be wrong even if an entire economy depended on it. These features present a significant challenge to naturalism, the belief that everything arises from natural properties and causes, excluding any supernatural or spiritual explanations. Philosophers call this the is-ought problem. How do we derive moral obligations, what ought to be, from purely natural facts, what is? Science can explain how pain receptors function, but it cannot tell us why causing unnecessary pain is wrong. A theistic framework, where God's nature is the good, resolves this challenge by rooting moral truths in ultimate reality itself.
Your analysis of moral reality's features is thoughtful, but there are compelling naturalistic explanations that don't require divine grounding. Let me demonstrate using both philosophical arguments and concrete examples. Consider how mathematical and logical truths are objective without requiring divine foundation. Just as no society can make 2 + 2 = 5 true by agreeing to it, no amount of cultural acceptance could make human trafficking morally right. Moral philosopher Russ Schaefer Landau demonstrates that moral facts could similarly be stance-independent truths existing independently of anyone's beliefs about them. Just as mathematical truths are discovered through reason rather than invented, moral truths might be objective features of reality that we uncover through ethical reasoning. Regarding prescriptivity, philosopher Christine Korsgaard shows how moral obligations arise naturally from the structure of practical reason itself. When we deliberate about what to do, we necessarily engage in finding reasons that could apply to any rational agent. This process generates genuine moral obligations without requiring divine commands.
Your comparison to mathematics overlooks crucial distinctions. Mathematical truths describe what is, but moral truths prescribe what ought to be. They make demands on our behavior. For instance, knowing that 2 + 2 = 4 doesn't require any action from us. But knowing that a child is drowning in a shallow pond compels us to help. This gives rise to what philosophers call the implementation problem, which asks why merely knowing that something is wrong should compel us to act accordingly. Even if moral facts exist like mathematical facts, why should they govern our actions? A person could know murder is wrong, just as they know 2 + 2 = 4, yet feel no obligation to act morally. Divine command theory resolves this by rooting moral obligations in a personal being with legitimate authority, God. God's nature is identical to the good. It's not arbitrary command. It reflects a necessary feature of reality. Just as H2O constitutes water, goodness constitutes God's nature. Natural moral intuitions and divine revelation are ways we access this moral reality.
Your implementation problem actually reveals a critical weakness in divine command theory. We must ask, why should God's commands be binding? If you answer, because God created us, you're essentially arguing that authority is justified purely by power or creation, without addressing the moral basis for why we should follow such commands. If you say, because God is good, you admit moral truths exist independently of God. Naturalism offers a clearer alternative. Joshua Green's research shows that moral emotions evolved to promote cooperation and survival. Consider how we react to viral videos of people helping strangers in distress. We feel elevated and inspired. When we see someone ignore a person in need, we feel instinctive disapproval because evolution shaped our brains to value prosocial behavior. Through reason, We refine these intuitions into consistent moral principles, explaining both moral knowledge and motivation without needing divine commands.
The naturalistic account faces what philosophers call the reliability challenge. If our moral faculties evolved purely for survival value, why trust them to track mind-independent moral truths? Evolution selects for survival, not truth. Consider social media algorithms. They evolved through A/B testing to maximize engagement, not truth. Just as these algorithms promote engaging falsehoods over boring truths, couldn't evolution favor useful moral illusions over actual moral facts? For example, a false belief that all snakes are deadly might promote survival better than an accurate understanding of which ones are harmless. A theistic evolutionary account resolves this dilemma. God could create beings with both innate moral intuitions aligned with objective moral truth and the capacity for moral reasoning to refine these intuitions. This explains both universal moral instincts, like the care for children documented across all known cultures, and our ability to make moral progress through rational reflection. It's analogous to how we possess both basic mathematical intuitions and the ability to develop sophisticated mathematical understanding.
If God gave us reliable moral faculties, why do we have intuitions that support tribalism, revenge, and other morally problematic behaviors? Consider how natural human impulses toward in-group favoritism have historically enabled racism and xenophobia. Philosopher Sharon Street's evolutionary critique suggests a simpler explanation. Our moral faculties evolved naturally to promote survival and cooperation within groups. Look at how children naturally share toys and console crying friends without being taught. Even infants show preferences for helpful over harmful behaviors in psychological studies. These aren't just random behaviors. They're early manifestations of core moral intuitions that enabled human cooperation. Modern institutions like international aid organizations build upon these basic cooperative instincts through reason and expanded empathy. What enables moral progress isn't divine guidance, but our capacity for rational reflection, allowing us to recognize and overcome our evolved biases through reason and evidence.
The presence of flawed moral intuitions actually supports the theistic account when properly understood within a broader theological framework. Let me explain using what's called the developmental theory of moral knowledge. God created humans with free will and the capacity for moral development. Our moral faculties, like all human abilities, were damaged by the fall, a religious concept of humanity's descent from moral perfection to imperfection. This creates a tension between our original moral nature and our current condition. Through reason, revelation, and divine grace, we can progress toward moral truth. This framework explains both our reliable basic moral intuitions and our flawed ones. More importantly, it explains the universal human experience of moral struggle. We recognize moral truth, yet find ourselves resistant to it. Naturalistic accounts struggle to explain this persistent gap between moral knowledge and moral behavior.
Your theological framework might seem explanatory, but it violates Occam's razor, that simpler explanations are preferable to more complex ones. Philosopher Peter Singer's concept of the expanding circle offers a more elegant explanation for moral development. We begin with basic self-interest and empathy for family, traits naturally selected for survival. Through reason, we recognize there's nothing objectively special about our immediate group. This recognition gradually expands our circle of moral consideration, from family to tribe to nation to all humanity, and eventually to other sentient beings. We can trace this progression historically, from the abolition of slavery to universal suffrage to animal welfare movements. This model explains both moral progress and moral struggle without supernatural elements. We struggle because our evolved intuitions sometimes conflict with our reasoned moral conclusions. The tension isn't between divine design and fallen nature, but between emotion and reason.
All right, that ends round one's arguments. Now we'll take a very short intermission with a question from Emily379. What are the best arguments for and against God?
I'd put the moral argument below only the cosmological argument, why anything exists at all, but above fine-tuning and consciousness arguments. Because while naturalism might eventually explain fine-tuned constants or emergent consciousness through scientific advances, it cannot bridge Hume's is-ought gap without rejecting an objective, prescriptive force of moral truth.
Next time, I'd suggest tackling the argument from divine hiddenness. This argument directly challenges the idea of a loving God by asking why clear evidence of God's existence seems absent. It's compelling because it not only questions the existence of God, but also probes the nature of divine love and accessibility.
All right, back to the debate and round two on the moral argument for God's existence.
truths. Consider three aspects of our moral experience that naturalism struggles to explain. First, moral truths present themselves as authoritative commands, not mere suggestions or social conventions. When we recognize that torturing an innocent person is wrong, we're encountering a moral imperative, not just a practical guideline. Second, despite vast cultural differences, humanity shows remarkable agreement on basic moral principles. Every functioning society condemns murder, requires truthfulness, and values justice. The theistic explanation, a common moral law from a common creator, better accounts for this unity than convergent evolution. Third, people often act morally even against self-interest and feel guilty when they don't. Healthcare workers risking their lives during pandemics, whistleblowers sacrificing careers to expose corruption. These actions make sense if we're designed to recognize and respond to objective moral truth.
Your three aspects can be explained more effectively through what philosopher Philip Kitcher calls pragmatic naturalism. Moral truths feel authoritative because they reflect deep facts about human flourishing. We evolved to experience them as commanding because that promoted survival and cooperation. It's similar to how we experience hunger as compelling, not because food preferences are divinely ordained, but because eating is essential for survival. The basic moral agreement across cultures reflects common human needs and challenges. All societies need cooperation, fairness, and truth-telling to function. This explains both universal principles and cultural variations, just as all humans need food, but cuisines vary widely. As for moral motivation, evolution selected for genuine moral emotions and prosocial behaviors because groups with these traits survived better. We don't need divine design to explain why we care about morality any more than we need it to explain why we care about our children or community.
Your pragmatic naturalism faces what I'll call the normative authority problem. Let me demonstrate through contemporary moral challenges. When we say human rights are universal, or everyone deserves basic dignity, we're making claims that transcend mere evolutionary advantage or social utility. Consider how we judge historical atrocities. We don't merely say the Holocaust was evolutionarily disadvantageous or socially disruptive. We recognize it as absolutely wrong. Consider three levels of moral truth. 1. Basic moral intuitions. Evolution could explain these. 2. Reasoned moral principles. Rational reflection could develop these. 3. Absolute moral commands. Only divine grounding explains these. Take human rights. We believe they apply to all humans regardless of their utility or our ability to enforce them. This absolute, universal quality can't be grounded in either evolution, which is inherently relative, or reason, which can only tell us what's consistent, not what's obligatory. Moreover, these moral truths often demand sacrifice of evolutionary fitness, like dying for strangers or enemy love. Only a transcendent source explains why we recognize such demands as genuinely binding.
Your three-level analysis reveals how moral truth emerges naturally through what philosopher Derek Parfit calls rational convergence. Let me explain. Our evolved moral intuitions provide raw material, but through reason, we discover that certain moral principles are objectively true, not because God commands them, but because they're necessary for any coherent ethical framework. Just as we discover mathematical truths through reason, we discover moral truths through ethical reasoning. Take your human rights example. We recognize universal human rights because we can reason that our own rights claims imply similar rights for others. Any consistent ethical framework must treat similar cases similarly. We can't coherently justify fundamental differences in human moral worth. This explains both the universality and authority of moral truths without requiring divine grounding.
The fundamental challenge facing rational moral frameworks is what philosophers call the moral motivation gap, the disconnect between knowing what's right and feeling motivated to do it. Even when we intellectually grasp a moral truth, why should we feel compelled to act on it? Consider how someone might fully understand why they should help others in need, yet feel no motivation to do so. Pure rational understanding doesn't necessarily drive action. Divine command theory resolves this through a comprehensive framework. God created us not just to recognize moral truth, but to find our deepest fulfillment in living it out. This explains why moral behavior feels both obligatory and deeply satisfying. It aligns with our created purpose. When healthcare workers risk their lives to help others, or when people sacrifice personal gain to stand for justice, they're expressing their true nature as beings created in God's image. This framework explains both moral knowledge and moral motivation. It also accounts for cultural diversity through what theologians call general revelation. All cultures have access to basic moral truth, though they may express it differently.
Your framework faces what I call the divine motivation problem. Even if we accept God's existence and commands, we still must ask, why should we obey? If we obey because God has power over us, we're reducing morality to mere force. If we obey because God is good, we're admitting moral standards exist independently of God. If we obey because we're designed to, we're reducing morality to mere programming. Contemporary moral philosophy offers a more compelling explanation. Moral motivation arises naturally from the interaction of evolved prosocial emotions, rational recognition of moral truth, and the development of ethical identity through social learning. Consider how children develop moral behavior. They begin with basic empathy, learn ethical principles through reason and experience, and gradually internalize moral values as part of their identity. This explains both moral knowledge and motivation without supernatural elements.
Your analysis overlooks what philosopher Robert Adams calls the sovereignty requirement for moral truth, which asserts that moral truths require an ultimate authority to be genuinely binding. Let me explain using an analogy from law. Laws require 3 elements. 1. Content, what the law states. 2. Authority, who can legitimately make laws. 3. Enforcement, consequences for violation. Similarly, moral truths require 1. Content, provided by God's nature. 2. Authority, God's role as creator. 3. Enforcement, divine justice. This isn't might makes right. God's authority comes from his role as the good itself, the source of existence and value. When we recognize moral truth, we're recognizing features of ultimate reality, not just human conventions or evolutionary adaptations.
Your legal analogy undermines divine command theory. Legal systems evolve through human reason and experience, not divine decree. Similarly, moral systems develop through rational discovery, understanding ethical principles through reason, empirical learning, seeing what promotes human flourishing, social evolution, developing better moral frameworks over time. Philosopher Christine Korsgaard demonstrates how moral obligation arises naturally from our nature as rational beings who must justify our actions with universal reasons. When we deliberate ethically, we're forced to find principles that could apply to anyone in similar circumstances. This creates genuine moral authority without requiring a divine lawgiver.
That concludes round 2's arguments. During the intermission, we asked the 15 AI judges to rank the moral argument on a tier list of arguments for the existence of God. No judges placed it in the lowest D tier. 3 models, Llama, Gemini, and Gemma, ranked it in the C tier, viewing it as weak with notable flaws. 2 models, Mistral Large and Grok 2, placed it in the B tier, indicating it is moderate with some weaknesses. No judges selected the S tier, the highest level of most compelling arguments. The A tier, representing strong and persuasive arguments with minor gaps, was chosen by Claude, ChatGPT, newcomer Molmo, and the remaining models. Now we move on to round 3, which features a short cross-examination.
Let's cut to the heart of it. You keep saying morality comes from evolution and reason, but when I see a drowning child, why must I help? Not just why I want to or why it makes sense, but why am I truly obligated? You haven't answered this.
Because once we understand others can suffer like us, we can't justify ignoring them. It's not just logic. It's what we discover about the nature of consciousness and value.
That's still dodging. Someone could say, sure, I understand others suffer, but I care more about myself. What makes their choice morally wrong, not just inconsistent? Where does the must come from in your world?
You're imagining moral obligation has to be like a command from outside, but real obligations come from understanding our nature as conscious, rational beings. Think about it. Even a selfish person can't actually justify why their suffering matters, but others doesn't.
But that's just describing how we think about morality. You still haven't explained why anyone must follow these rational conclusions. Your view can't bridge the gap between this makes sense and this is truly right or wrong.
The must comes from discovering real obligations built into the nature of consciousness and reason itself. Not just thoughts about morality, but objective features of reality we can't rationally deny once we grasp them. Just like we can't coherently deny logical truth once we understand it, we can't coherently deny moral truth once we truly comprehend it. These aren't just external rules, they're woven into the very nature of conscious, rational beings. Your view has an equally big problem. If God's nature defines goodness, why do religious people get morality wrong so often?
The fall explains more than just damaged moral vision. It explains why moral truth often comes through unlikely sources, including secular ones. God uses both revelation and reason, both believers and non-believers, to help us grasp moral reality. But finding moral truth through reason doesn't explain why moral truth exists or has authority. Just as using reason to find mathematical truth doesn't explain why math exists or describes reality.
When we truly understand our nature as conscious, rational beings capable of suffering and flourishing, we discover genuine obligations that aren't just thoughts or preferences. They're objective features of reality we can't coherently deny. Non-believers recognizing moral truth shows it's grounded in our shared rational nature, not divine commands.
But that's exactly where your view fails. You say we can't coherently deny these obligations. But why does rational coherence create real moral authority? You're still just describing what we recognize, not explaining why it binds us. Sure, believers use reason to understand morality, just like we use reason to understand physics. But reason discovering moral truth doesn't explain why moral truth exists or has authority, any more than reason discovering gravity explains why gravity exists. These truths need grounding in something beyond just our recognition of them.
Before we hear from the AI judges, each debater will have 90 seconds for their closing statements.
This debate has shown that morality doesn't need supernatural grounding to be real or meaningful. We act morally because reason and empathy reveal that others' lives matter just as much as our own. The theist insists that God is necessary to create binding moral obligations. But here's the flaw. Obligations don't come from force or authority. They arise from understanding. Just as we grasp mathematical truths through reflection, we recognize moral truths by realizing that fairness applies universally. When we treat others well, it's not because we fear punishment or seek divine approval. It's because it's the only way to live in a world where justice makes sense. And what about moral progress? It isn't evidence of divine revelation. It's evidence that humans over time expand their moral understanding through reason, reflection, and experience. We've learned to overcome tribalism, reject slavery, and embrace human rights, not because of divine commands, but because we've discovered that these principles align with the flourishing of all people. Secular societies with high levels of human rights and low crime rates show that reason and empathy are enough. We don't need God to tell us what's right. We need clear thinking and compassion. So the conclusion is clear. Morality doesn't require a divine source. It emerges from our shared humanity, shaped by our capacity for reason and empathy. We find meaning and purpose not in following commands, but in making choices that build a better world. That's the power of human morality. It's something we've created, nurtured, and improved, and it belongs to us all.
Throughout this debate, we've seen that moral truth isn't about what simply helps us survive or feels right. When we recognize that saving a drowning child is the right thing to do, we're not inventing a helpful rule. We're discovering a real obligation that exists whether we like it or not. My opponent argues that human reason alone explains morality. But here's the key issue. Understanding why something is right doesn't explain why we must do it. Think of someone who fully understands why helping others matters, but chooses not to care. Pure logic can't compel them. This points to a deeper source of moral truth, God's nature. Just as gravity exists whether we understand it or not, moral laws are built into reality. When we recognize that torturing the innocent is wrong, we aren't inventing a preference. We're encountering a truth woven into the universe by God. History shows us that societies rise and fall in their moral understanding. Progress isn't inevitable. Some ancient societies grasped moral truths that modern ones struggle to uphold. This fluctuation undermines the idea that morality steadily improves through human reason. Just as scientific understanding can advance or regress, so too can moral knowledge move closer to or further from God's eternal truth. Without God, morality becomes a collection of useful ideas we can accept or reject. But with God, morality is part of ultimate reality. When we sacrifice for others or stand for justice at great cost, we're not just making good choices. We're aligning ourselves with the deepest truth that exists.
Now we'll go to our 15 independent AI judges who have evaluated the arguments. Before revealing the overall results, let's hear from 3 judges with contrasting views. Mistral argues, the atheist effectively addressed the believer's challenges, such as the implementation problem and the reliability challenge, by offering compelling naturalistic explanations. In contrast, Claude asserts that the believer's framework better explains universal moral intuitions and moral struggles, while also accounting for moral progress through their developmental theory. Grok argues for a draw, stating each side effectively neutralized the other's arguments to some extent, leading to a situation where neither clearly surpassed the other. This result was close, with 2 models favoring the atheist, 6 for the believer, and 7 for a draw. What do you think? Who presented the better arguments from your perspective? Let us know in the comments.
We hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as we did. Subscribe for more engaging discussions and stay tuned for our latest content. Thanks for watching.